Hey everyone, so welcome to the Banh Mi Chronicles podcast. I am Randy Kim, and so I am bringing in a familiar guest. You may remember them with such crisis emergency episodes that we've been doing. And I have said to Jung for the longest that I've got to get you on an episode where we can actually talk about things that are a low lift and not as deeply triggering, such as ICE raid violence or mental health or the state of the Trump 2.0 administration. So I was thinking about what would be a really good topic. And knowing you, you've always been a big fan of Lilith Fair, and we're at the 30-year mark of the debut of Lilith Fair, which is really hard to believe. And so I wanted to dive into the topic of the cultural impact and the legacy that Lilith Fair had during its time, but also in the years following, and how does it stack up in today's current climate? And so, Jung has always been a big fan of so many of the artists that were a part of Lilith Fair, and I would love you, Jung, to quickly reintroduce yourself and also what's really making you excited about today's topic.
Hi everyone. I'm Jung, and I'm excited to be here to talk with Randy. It's one of these times where we're bringing like one of our conversations that we might have on the phone like into the podcast. And it's also like you said, like it's a lighter topic, and I feel like we haven't been able to do that on your podcast yet. Like the first episode, we talked about suicide and mental health, and then the two episodes after that were about responding to the ICE and Border Patrol raids, and being able to keep yourself safe around like protest safety and protest health and wellness. So, um, yeah, I feel like anytime we get to talk about pop culture is always fun for me. Usually it's not recorded. We talk about pop culture a lot. So I'm excited to have something not related to uh, the just, yeah, the terrible political situation. Although everything is political, right? So we're probably going to get
Absolutely.
into that, but something definitely not related to death and grief, at least.
Yeah, and I also want to point out to listeners that this will always be a fuck ICE, an anti-genocide zone. So even if we are talking about pop culture stuff, like especially with me with other episodes, this will firmly remain um very strong in the anti-ICE and the anti-genocide and the anti-state sanctioned violence that we currently deal with. So just to give you a heads up that yeah, that still stands. But anyways, I also hope that listening to this episode will be a good way um to decompress and also to really enjoy some of the nostalgia of the yesteryears, especially if you are a Gen X or an older millennial. And I think that that what I think about the music that we were listening to, like for myself as a kid, I mean, Vietnamese and Cambodian music were very present in the household. But when it came to Western music, it was Simon and Garfunkel, a little bit of Elton John, the Eagles, and that slowly came into like the B96, which is a Chicago top 40 radio station where house music was very prevalent, and that was what I was growing up towards. And then, there was like the mid 90s alternative rock era mixed in with the hip hop of Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. So I was exposed to a lot of top 40 radio music at that time. But what about for you? What was the music that you were growing up listening to, and how did it shape the way you grew up in upstate New York as a queer Korean American adoptee?
Yeah, as I've shared in other episodes, I'm transnationally and transracially adopted. So I grew up in a white family. Both my parents are white. My younger sister is white. And so I was the only person of color in my family, and also was like growing up in a part of Western New York, which like I describe as like the Midwest of the Northeast.
Hmm.
It's like the Ohio part of New York State, uh, but surrounded by a lot of white people. Like the county where I grew up was like, I don't know, maybe like 90 something, 85, 90% white people. So I was like very heavily growing up in white culture, and even the other racialized family members that I had, like my godmother is a refugee from Cambodia. Uh, like I wasn't necessarily listening to Cambodian music
Hmm.
with her. It was like a lot of like mainstream corporate music. I also, there was an independent radio station that I listened to that was connected to like one of the universities or like one of the school systems where I grew up. So it was a lot of, for me, like some of the music that you said, the classic rock of like, I loved Fleetwood Mac, I loved
Hmm.
Carole King, and like Elton John. Like Elton John was one of my first
Hmm.
concerts. Loved Simon and Garfunkel's, the Eagles. Really got into Pink Floyd when I was in high school. Listening to like mainstream like pop punk and ska, like that was really big in the 90s. I say even today that like white boys, instead of making podcasts, should be like making music in their garages and in empty swimming pools. That like if we had more ska bands, then like white guys had more trombone mouthpieces in their mouths and fewer mics, then we might be living in a better place. But I was like super obsessed with like Newfound Glory and like Less Than Jake, something corporate, Blink 182, although some people would not count Blink 182 as like pop punk, but like
Hmm.
that was like some of the seen as some of the more independent music that I was into, although they are definitely like corporate bands. And then uh, definitely like the women who were making music that was either they were at Lilith Fair or they were adjacent to Lilith Fair, similar to the type of music that was being played there. So I was like a
Hmm.
huge Sarah McLachlan fan. I also love like Tracy Chapman, Natalie Merchant. I feel like that was
Hmm.
one of the like
Hmm.
surprise musical artists that like I feel like people who would look at us today and not be like, wow, they were both like Natalie Merchant fans in high school. So that
Hmm.
was like an interesting thing to like learn about you and our friendship.
Hmm.
But also, like Alanis Morissette, and I love Ani DeFranco, like
Hmm.
Ani DeFranco, as well as the Goo Goo Dolls, the band's the Goo Goo Dolls. They both got their start in Buffalo, New York, which is like an hour and a half from where I grew up. So they were, Ani DeFranco especially was like very, very well known in Western New York before she became more widely known on the national level. And then my other kind of big type of music genre of music that I was listening to when I was in high school was musical theater. Like I was such a theater kid. I was obsessed with Rent. I used to be able to recite the entire libretto of Rent without music.
Wow.
That's like how much I listened to Rent, but was also kind of like a Candor and Ebb type of musical theater fan. Not necessarily like an Andrew Lloyd Webber, Rodgers and Hammerstein type of musical fan. Although I do love The Sound of Music. I performed in The Sound of Music in high school, but was, like Chicago and Cabaret. Like
Hmm.
that was my jam. So yeah, it was like a few different types of music that I was listening to when I was a kid, but all definitely, I think, music that was situated within like a mainstream white
Hmm.
culture.
Yeah, what did your parents listen to during that time? And was it music that you were also like uh that you've adopted into your musical world?
Yeah, my parents were the ones that introduced me to the classic rock music.
Hmm.
So, like Carole King,
Oh.
Elton John, Simon and Garfunkel, the Eagles. like they were, my parents loved them and loved listening to them, and so like that's how I got introduced to those artists. They also were really big fans of like Harry Chapin and
Mm.
Gordon Lightfoot and like these other artists who were like in that classic rock era. Um, so that's how I got introduced to them. Interestingly enough, I got introduced to Fleetwood Mac later because
Mm.
Fleetwood Mac had a like big VH1 reunion concert when I was in high school, and so
And
like
behind the music
everybody in my
too.
high school,
And behind the music too with Stevie Nicks. I remember
exactly,
that one.
exactly. So like everybody in my high school was like obsessed with, or in my friend group at least, was obsessed with Fleetwood Mac. But like Fleetwood Mac, I feel like has these times where they keep coming back. So like around that was one of them. Like when TikTok started getting made with Dreams, like that was another one.
Oh,
Like
when Bill
Fleetwood Mac
Clinton
just keeps, yeah.
when Bill Clinton was running for president, I think for his inauguration, invited Fleetwood Mac. That's how I
Uh-huh.
remembered them was when "Don't Stop" was his political
Yeah.
um, song. So that song was pretty much like etched into my brain for a while
Yeah, I
there.
think Bill Clinton got elected when we were probably in middle school. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you? Because like with your parents being diasporic, like
Hmm.
were they listening to like classic rock stuff that was on the radio? How did you get introduced to that through them or like through finding it on the radio
You know,
yourself?
interestingly enough, like um the first Western music that my dad introduced me to was Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water. And that album, I mean, he would play that album ad nauseum, like over and over and over again. I mean, I got sick of it at that time, but I remembered how much my dad really loved Bridge Over Troubled Water to Cecilia and that El Condor Paso, like, which I find that song incredibly annoying. I think I went to Puerto Rico and this man who was a guitarist was basically talking about how he like really butchered that classic and he hated he was like, going on a rant about it. So ever since then I have to skip that song. But but The Boxer is a song that my dad loves playing. I do remember it quite a bit. My brothers and I really enjoyed listening to it. This is like one of the few artists that we could actually bond over. And when my brother passed away, we actually played The Only Living Boy in New York. Which was I think was like towards the last end of that album, and that song was what I would find out was um the friendship dissolving between Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel, and but felt um I've always felt a tenderness for that song, and so especially now it's like it's a song that really takes me back to a very raw place. So yes, I I will say that Simon and Garfunkel was a big one for me. um Santana, one of the things during right before the genocide when the US soldiers were stationed in Cambodia, um rock music, US Western rock music was playing constantly, whereas the Rolling Stones, Santana, um, Carole King, the Western artists were starting to make an impression on a lot of Cambodian artists at that time. So they would, do covers. One of my favorite Cambodian covers is I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but she did a cover of Carole King, "It's Too Late," and unfortunately she died during the genocide. And so when I hear that song, it's a very beautiful song, and I think when I was in Cambodia I was playing it as I was walking through the Independence Monument too. It felt kind of like I was in a time warp. um and I think about how um hard it is to like listen to some of these songs from that era because it came from a very um it came from a very violent era, unfortunately. And so it's both beautiful, but it's also very haunting to me. And I know that my dad really gravitated towards that particular era, the Egos being one of them. I mean, I don't know what older Asian man hasn't played Hotel California for the umpteenth time. And I know that my brothers love that song so much that they have played like live versions of it. And I cannot tell you how much I hate that song. Um, but my brothers adopted that, so you know. Um, so like as I was like into my grade school to middle school years, like most of the music that I was listening to in the car with them is like listening to light FM radio. Like in Chicago it's 93.9. Um I started getting exposed to Mariah Carey when she was doing more adult contemporary, like the song Hero or Vision of Love. And then I started to become more into her music when, her Daydream album came out in 95. Then I became interested in Janet Jackson and I started getting into B96 music because a lot of my classmates were listening to top 40 radio, and so I would start to hear about the latest artists or what's going on with MTV. And I didn't have MTV, I didn't have VH1, didn't have cable, so I would get, I would get, I would get, I would hear about these artists through the grapevine, through some of my classmates, and I would try to find a way to listen to these songs, and I was obsessed with the radio ever since then. Um, what did it feel like for you as you were getting older and you started discovering music on your own? What do you feel like really started to like grab your attention away from when you kind of started seeing your parents' music as no longer cool, you know?
Well, it's interesting because the music that my parents listen to, like, I still think it's cool.
Hmm.
Um, like it's formed a foundation for the type of music that I like, which is a lot of like folk and singer-songwriter music. So like that's a big aspect of what I like, even though um the artist that I'm listening to has like really diversified. So like whereas, I was introduced to like Cat Stevens as
Oh,
a
wow.
kid. Like now I'm listening to like Rhiannon Giddens and like Our Native
Hmm.
Daughters, which is like Black women led folk singer
Hmm.
songwriter music that like comes out of like a Black American music tradition. So I feel like that's like some of the building blocks that like built my musical tastes, some of my musical tastes today. It's really interesting because I didn't get heavily into pop music
Hmm.
until I was an adult. When I was a teenager, I was so insufferable. I was very much like, if something gets too popular, like it's not good anymore. And so it was like the boy band eras, like as I was older, when I was like super, super young, like a kid,
Hmm.
I was a fan of New Kids on the Block, but like
Hmm.
as boy bands grew, it was like not my thing at all. My sister was very into boy bands. Um, but I didn't really get back into pop music until probably like my 30s,
Oh, wow.
um, which I think we could have a really long conversation about that too,
Mhm.
and about the like why it took me so long to like let music written in major keys like back into my life. Um, but I think that I think it's interesting that so much of the music that I grew up on stayed with me today,
Mhm.
even though like I'm estranged from my parents. Like I'm listening to the music that we listened to,
Mhm.
like going to, we went to see Elton John together
You did.
in Milwaukee, and Elton John and Billy Joel was like one of the first concerts that I ever
Mhm.
went to with my parents when I was like, I don't know, somewhere between like 5 and 9 years old.
Wow.
Um, so it's interesting how like that music just remains so timeless to me. Like it just really
Mhm.
stands the test of time. Um, and there's some music that just continues to do that, and then some
Mhm.
music that um, doesn't hold up. But I'm glad that like some of that music does. I don't know that Blink 180 all of Blink 182 songs have held up.
Although that there's such a demand for them, and I'm like, why? I mean, I tried to get in Blink 182, but I was also kind of okay. You're laughing at me. I did like Offspring. Don't ask me why. I'm trying to remember what
Did you
other.
want to be pretty fly for a white
I
guy?
know. Give it to me, baby. Uh-huh, uh-huh. And when I have to listen, when I look back and listen to the song, like, God, this is incredibly ridiculous, absurd. And um and like when I think about or when we think about the era of or what the landscape was looking like for 90s women artists, I immediately think about the pop spectacles like Madonna, Mariah Carey, Whitney Houston, Celine Dion, Janet Jackson, Paula Abdul, who are very bigger than life personas and also very much like individualistic. They had the charisma. They had the appeal of young girls and and it was interesting because they stood in contrast to like the singer-songwriters of years past, like a Joni Mitchell or Carole King or Carly Simon, and or how they're measured against their elder peers, like say Aretha Franklin, Diana Ross, or Barbara Streisand. And I think this is a very interesting timeline because those women artists, especially of the 90s that I mentioned earlier, they weren't just selling a million records, they were selling millions of records. They were
They were
dominating.
huge. I mean, do
Yeah.
you remember VH1 Divas, right?
Oh, of course I do.
I
Yes.
feel like there's all these things, including Lilith Fair, right? That like I'll talk with people about them today, and like they will have no idea. But it's like, remember when VH1 used to have these concerts where like Aretha Franklin, it'd be like Aretha Franklin and Celine Dion and Mariah Carey, and they're like all together on a stage. Like when I think of that era of music and like 90s pop divas, I think of you. Like that's such a cornerstone of like the music that you love and that you talk about.
Yeah. And I think of like Whitney Houston, like the Bodyguard
Hmm.
soundtrack held the top spot for like a good 2 years. I think I
Oh my
remember
God.
this, and I remember
Such a
like,
classic soundtrack. So good.
yeah. And actually, I think Madonna, I think Kurt Loder, if you remember Kurt Loder, like, he would always interview
I do.
Madonna. I
Yeah.
know. And he's actually in his 80s, by the way, too, which is kind of hard to imagine. But like he would say, like, yeah, Boyz II Men is still in the charts, and she's like, man, the Boyz II Men is still in the charts. Why can't I be number one? And this damn Bodyguard soundtrack still number one, and this is like 1995. So this tells you how long that soundtrack was enduring,
I
and
wore out the cassette tape of that soundtrack.
Waiting to Exhale on top of it, which was
Hmm.
also like powered by Black women artists besides Whitney Houston. You also had Toni Braxton, you had Brandy, and Aretha Franklin was on that album. So like I think of my exposure to a lot of women artists really drove a lot of my music listening history and and for women rock artists, this was an interesting time because Courtney Love was coming in, but she was also like a bigger than life persona. I think people remember her more for the tabloids and her marriage with Kurt Cobain and the aftermath of his passing. And so people paid more attention to her own controversies more than her music. And people forget that she was in a band called Hole, you know, and it was the album um that debut album was released. Live Through This was released like I think a day after Kurt's passing. I think it was within that same timeline. So she was starting to really emerge a front as a front person for Hole and with rock music. And then you also had Sarah McLachlan, who you mentioned earlier, who would be the founder of Lilith Fair. Tracy Chapman, several years earlier, had a massive hit song, A Fast Car. She disappeared for a couple of years and then around 1996 emerged big time when Give Me One Reason, which was a big summer hit. Um, Liz Fair, uh, a local Chicagoan, really making her way in the indie world. Sheryl Crow, Lance Armstrong, which I can't listen to anything after. I think Lance Armstrong basically ruined quality music. That's a whole nother topic I'll have to bring up for a Sheryl Crow episode. but like I was obsessed with Sheryl Crow. That second album had me in a chokehold. I think of Melissa Etheridge, an out queer woman of rock, a woman rock artist, and people call her like the Bruce Springsteen ants, the women answer to Bruce Springsteen, which I also don't think it's fair, you know. But you think of Nellie Merchant, who I absolutely love. I mean, I think of the song Wonder, the song Carnival, which just really gives me goosebumps, and Alanis Morissette. I mean, like the Bodyguard soundtrack, that album had a long shelf life. Like it really endured for a good couple of years, from 94 to like 97. I think it had a good 3 year run. And that album became like what people remember the most. And then you think of Tori Amos, Fiona Apple, Indigo Girls. So it created like this big wave of this independent focused women singer-songwriters that explored personal narratives and serious themes such as mental health, being in very abusive, toxic relationships, sex, childhood. And during that time, it felt like a breath of fresh air when the music industry has always been traditionally been very straight, very white male dominated, whether it's in the record labels, core promoters, record stores, radio, MTV, VH1. You look at Clive Davis and Tommy Mottola, who ran Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey's career early on. Renee, who was the husband of Celine Dion, running her career. So it felt like even when those artists were selling big time records, they were also in a way overshadowed by the men in their life, the male figure in their lives that really ran the corporate lens and tried to push these artists as more products rather than as artists as individuals. So it felt more like a very possessive relationship. Um, and but when you look at the women rock artists, it felt like a total contrast to that. It felt like it was more, in some ways, like like a response back to this controlled narrative of a successful women pop singer. But when you have a woman with a guitar writing her own songs, um, not beholden to like mammoth record labels, it felt freeing. But what was your take on that particular era of that the wave of women artists that were coming out?
Well, one of the things that, like when you were sharing all of that, that I remembered and that like I wanted to ask you about is kind of the reaction from my peers to the music that I was listening to. Like I was a person, I don't know about you, I was a person that got frequently bullied when I was
Mm,
in school, like elementary school, middle school, high school. Like I was just bullied in a bunch of ways, like all through that. And like the
mm,
music that I listened to was part of that, up until a point. So like I loved listening to like female singer songwriters, and then I also listened to, they were the folks who were getting played on like the top 40 or the adult contemporary station. But then I also was listening to the indie station. So, like I was listening to Sarah McLachlan, I was
mm,
listening to Tracy Chapman and Sheryl Crow, but I was also like listening to Hole. I was like
mm,
learning who like Luscious Jackson was. Like I
mm,
was,
mm,
and then I was listening to like hearing like Ani DeFranco, which she was like very indie at that time, still
mm,
is. She started her own record label. And so like it's interesting how like I would get bullied for listening to folks like Sarah McLachlan or Tracy
mm,
Chapman, both before Lilith Fair was a thing and during it. I was called a lesbian, I was
mm,
gay, like I was already like an outspoken feminist as much as
mm,
I knew at that time of feminism, like at my school. And so I was teased for that.
mm,
Um, I didn't come out till like much later, till like my end of my teens and like into my early 20s. um but like when I would talk about like male fronted music that I was listening to, so when I would talk about like Newfound Glory, which like they're still around, or Less Than Jake, that was seen as cool. So it was an interesting contrast of like these women with guitars is and me being a feminist was like, oh, that means I'm a lesbian. But if I'm listening to Less Than Jake or I'm listening to Newfound Glory, like I'm cool now, because like that was seen as like
Mm,
more independent music back then, even if they were on major record labels. What
mm,
how did how did people react to the type of music that you were listening to when you were younger, especially because you loved so many 90s and 2000s pop
mm.
divas?
I did, and it was interesting because my school was kind of like was a mixture of still predominantly white, but also there were black students, there were Latino students, and I also had, I had, you know, surrounded myself with female classmates and with a lot of my male peers. So I felt like I was kind of dabbling in many different pots. Like with hip hop, I was sort of like my childhood best friend Scott um would like introduce me to like Bone Thugs and Harmony, Tupac, and I started being more obsessed with like listening to their music. I was like, wow, this is very different. This is something that my parents would never imagine me listening to or would want me to listen to, but it felt kind of rebellious. Um, Around the mid 90s, this was after Kurt Cobain passed. But there were people into Nirvana. I couldn't get into Nirvana. Pearl Jam, I didn't get into Pearl Jam until actually in college. And then I started to really like Pearl Jam at that particular period. Red Hot Chili Peppers, um, was a band that I did listen to.
You're
Smashing
like they
Pumpkins,
existed.
yeah, they did. Um, you know, um, and then you got Smashing Pumpkins, another
Oh
band that
yeah,
I
I
was
forgot about the
really,
Smashing Pumpkins. I was
yeah.
actually truly obsessed with them. I had all their albums and I was
Oh my
like
gosh.
not even in a crush way, but I was like obsessed with James Iha.
Yeah, I was kind of like drawn to him being an Asian American person and like wow, this is pretty dope. And Darcy and I watched The Simpsons at that time, so I would listen to like some of the music that was coming out from that era. And then what was it? Like like being able to just get bits and pieces of what people were listening to was very important. And but there was no, but there was something that was very powerful when I think of Mariah Carey and Whitney and Madonna, especially Madonna. Like um I'm trying to remember one particular moment, but I remember I went to Blockbuster. Rented I had my dad rent me the Immaculate Collection music videos. And that was something. My brothers started to make fun of me because I listened to Madonna. They were very, very visceral about that. Like you listen to Madonna, you listen to Mariah Carey, that's so gay. And
Oh
I would
my
hear that.
gosh, look at us. We were both getting called gay for our musical taste for listening to women.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, and did that change since then? Hell no. Um, but like yeah, and I just remember how formative that was, when I saw videos like Vogue and Express Yourself, and I was like, man, there's something that's so empowering about it that I, as a 12-year-old, very shy, didn't really have many friends, and I didn't know who I was and who I belonged to. So I felt like it was kind of an escape. And then, Janet Jackson came along around that period of time. I think in grade school, I remembered hearing the song Again, which was playing a gazillion times
Mm-hmm.
and the song Again was like this popular ballad that was from the Poetic Justice soundtrack. And it was also another ballad. I think it was just as overplayed, maybe not as overplayed as say, I Will Always Love You, but I was kind of drawn to her. I was drawn to her choreography. I wasn't so much into Michael Jackson, even growing up, even though people were still into him. But I think during the whole the sexual assault case that was happening during the mid 90s, it was not cool to listen to Michael Jackson. But his sister, was still very popular, still kind of like skirted around. the controversy and was still very much her own star. And so I was really drawn to her music. Celine Dion, my dad, I forgot to mention, my dad, we went to a Target, and my brother Tony remembers this too, which is kind of funny. In 1993 or 1994, the song Power of Love comes on. And my dad was glued to that TV when he saw her sing. Like he could not get enough of that song. So he got that album immediately. And I would hear the Power of Love like I don't know how many times. And I didn't get into Celine Dion back then, but I did when, the Because You Love Me and it's all coming back to me now. Then I started getting into her music after that, and so yeah, that was another part too. So I was really into that particular women pop, but then also women R&B. TLC was one of them. Salt and Pepper was one of them. Um, who else? Brandy and Monica. They were teenagers just like us, and I remember Brandy from Moesha, and I've always felt like this coolness from Brandy too. Like, when I listened to Sitting Up in My Room and her first album and The Boy Is Mine, I was like, yeah, it really takes me back. Aaliyah. So I was also kind of growing more into that era, the hip hop, the R&B. So I think I dabbled in way too many different pots pots and pans in the kitchen. Um and I also listened to, I don't know if you ever listened to Casey Kasem back in the day, but
Hmm. Yeah.
I used to like religiously listen to him like every weekend. I would actually start taking down his top 40 songs. And I would go to like
So
local coconuts. Yeah.
So for folks who don't know Casey Kasem, this was like it was every Sunday, right? That like
Hmm.
he would do this like DJ, it's several hour long DJ set where he would like play the like top 40
Hmm.
songs of that week. And there wasn't as much information like on the internet back then. And so unless you were like getting Billboard on a
Hmm.
regular basis, it
Hmm.
was like probably gonna be a surprise to you, like who
Hmm.
the top 40 was gonna be, especially those like top 10 or top five. So it was a big deal. You'd listen to the radio and find out like if the number one song changed.
Exactly. And I think I remember Mariah Carey and Boyz II Men, that One Sweet Day song, like every week. I was like, God, when is this song ever going
That
to
song
drop
was
down?
everywhere. Yeah.
Yes,
It's
exactly.
it's interesting like hearing both like our experience not both that's unsurprising that like we had a similar experience like heavily listening to so many female artists and like being bullied for it, but
Hmm.
also and I think that this is something that has continued, this idea of like underestimating the fandom of young people,
Hmm.
especially young women, but also young gay boys, whether they know that they're
Hmm.
queer or
Hmm.
not,
Hmm.
right? Like underestimating just the thirst for like this kind of music. And like in the 90s, like mainstream radio DJs, I feel like to like,
Hmm.
set the stage for like why did Lilith Fair exist and like talk about Lilith Fair, right? Like mainstream radio DJs, they were so opposed to playing female artists back to back or like a group with a female lead singer back to back with like a female artist, right? So like one of like the indie radio station I listened to, like they would do that. So you would hear like the Sneaker Pimps and then Ani DeFranco and then
Hmm.
Hole and Tori Amos, but like a top 40 station, like they they would just refuse to do that. Um, I know that that's like one of the things that like Sarah
Hmm.
McLachlan like had gotten feedback on, had heard, and so it was like part of why she had wanted to start Lilith Fair.
Yeah, which also brings me to this question, like, despite the fact that women artists were wildly successful, like, as with all the artists that I mentioned, why was it that top 40 to rock stations were like scared of even playing them back to back on the radio? That was
I
so
mean,
perplexing to
yeah,
me. Yeah.
the simple answer, right, is sexism, right? Just total sexism and misogyny, and underestimating the fandom, both underestimating the fandom of female artists, that like these female artists would be popular enough to like have fans, but also then underestimating um, just the interest of young women, and young men and boys who are interested in listening to female artists like you
Mhm.
were. I think similar to the kind of like swing back that we've seen today, like feminism in mainstream US culture has like gone back and forth between like being so present in like a narrative
Mhm.
conversation, and like experiencing a ton of backlash.
Mhm.
So like right now we are in one of those moments where like misogyny and
Mhm.
patriarchal culture, and like you talk about this around like the manosphere in the
Mhm.
podcast
Mhm.
space, that like that is like having such a rise. And I think that there was a similar rise that was happening back in the 80s and the 90s that was like all about masculinity, and trying to like push these ideas of masculinity in
Mhm.
music and in culture. um, like
Mhm. Mhm.
this was a time, right? So like we remember when we were in like middle school and high school, this is when like music festivals were starting and they would
Mhm.
like tour all over the place. Like I'll talk to people about something like Lollapalooza now,
Mhm.
and I'll be like, yeah, I remember when Lollapalooza used to play like 30 or 40 shows
Mhm.
like in different places all over the country. And now people very much see it as like Lollapalooza's like in
Mhm.
Chicago. So it was a much different type of landscape, but like all of those music festivals were were like they were male dominated, even if they
Mhm.
have like one or two like women fronted acts, right? And usually it
Mhm.
was it was bands that might have had men in them. It wasn't until later that like they started to have like female solo acts.
Mhm.
But like there was Lollapalooza, which was like started by Perry Farrell. There was
Mhm.
Warped Tour, which was the like pop punk ska space. There was Horde Tour, which was the like jam band, like mainstream jam band space, like Ozfest. It's like Ozzy Osbourne's thing. So like there wasn't there was all of these music festivals that were like shutting women out. There was like the
Mhm.
mainstream DJs who like wouldn't play women back to back on the radio.
Mhm.
And so like yeah, that was the space that like you and I were in when we were in high school, like getting fed all of this music on the radio.
Yeah, I think this is a great point that you bring up because when women artists start to be more assertive in their creative control or going above the comfort levels of the record company, Madonna at that time in the early 90s was the biggest artist. When you think of Taylor Swift, you think of Madonna back in the heyday where she was so controversial. But when she released the Sex Book, the backlash to her career was severe. Like people thought her career was over when she did sex, and it was a soft pornography book and that she curated, and that she was with other gay men of color, and and for a lot of men, they were repulsed at seeing naked gay men on there, and they were kind of like uncomfortable with the idea of seeing Madonna owning her own sexuality and being very provocative on her own terms, um not because she's serving them, that she's really serving herself and being in control and being in this perceived control. Sinead O'Connor, um, before the ripping the picture of the Pope on Saturday Night Live, she refused to stand for the national anthem, or she refused to have the U.S. national anthem played at her concert, and Frank Sinatra basically threatened to kick her ass. And Sinead had long been an outspoken activist, teamed up with Public Enemy, um, did a song called Black Boys on Mopeds, which was a call to the police violence that was happening against a young black person in England, I believe. And so she was really going into anti-war and becoming very outspoken at the peak of her career. And when she was on Saturday Night Live, it pretty much destroyed her career within seconds. And the backlash was so severe that when she performed at a Bob Dylan tribute, she got booed. But I'll never forget when Sinead decided to like stop that song she was supposed to sing and basically just did a quick a cappella of that war song by Bob Marley that she performed at Saturday Night Live and just stared right into the crowd and just started out and got very emotional. And that was hard for me to watch that. So you think about like some of the women artists that were trying to actually provoke, because once there was this idea, it's like, okay, I've achieved the fandom, I've achieved the attention of the media, but then when you step one foot too far, your career is like not only over, but your personal life is under attack. Courtney Love, after Kurt Cobain passed away, a lot of people still to this day still accuse her of killing Kurt Cobain. And it is very wild about the blatant misogyny. Like, oh yeah, well, Kurt Cobain wrote all of her music, Billy Corgan did all of her music. She's not as good as she thinks she is. So like the minimizing of these artists, or Mariah Carey, who's actually a singer-songwriter. People forget that too. She's not some plant. Like she actually wrote a lot of her own songs, and she would make it very clear that she did that work. So it tells you like the level of misogyny that even the most successful women artists have to like have to contend with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I think, yeah, what you were saying about Courtney Love reminds me of the frequent um narrative that people have around Yoko Ono and the Beatles, that like
Yes,
the
yes.
Beatles broke up because of Yoko Ono,
hmm
not because of like any decision making that like the
hmm
four male members of the
hmm
Beatles had or didn't have.
hmm
Yeah, I mean the misogyny, continued misogyny against Courtney Love uh is disappointing yet so predictable.
And
Yeah.
Fiona Apple, if you remember her MTV uh, acceptance speech, she was a 19-year-old person at the time, and she talked about the whole world is bullshit, which to me is an iconic,
Hmm.
speech, acceptance speech, if there is any. And but people like really made fun of her about that, and I'm like, what's there's no lie there. Like the world is bullshit, and you should not have to model by anybody but yourself. Like, what's controversial about that? But that's the world that they were living in, because the idea that women were asserting more control, creative control, was very threatening, and it was threatening the pockets of record labels and they feared losing that control over the women that they were trying to profit from.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, did you want me to like give a like quick and dirty intro to Lilith Fair? Because I
yes,
have learned actually that like even people, people that I'm friends with who are like within like 5 to 8 years of me, like have not heard of Lilith Fair. So I feel
right,
like
right.
um maybe we should have done it up top, but we can do it now of like what even is Lilith Fair. Um, so, and remind me, did you ever go to Lilith Fair?
I
I
have
know that
not.
it was like around here, probably at what, like Tinley Park or something. Um,
Probably,
yeah.
which is the worst venue still to this day.
I know how much you hate Tinley Park.
hmm
I went to it all 3 years. So I was like,
Mm,
I've seen Sarah McLachlan like 9 times. I've seen
wow.
the Indigo Girls a bunch of times. I've seen Ani DeFranco, although Ani DeFranco never performed at Lilith Fair.
Mm,
I've seen her like almost a dozen times. So like, yeah, it was, I used to spend a lot more time like going to concerts and seeing live music, but for folks who like haven't heard of Lilith Fair, so we just mentioned kind of like the landscape for music in the late 90s, in the 90s,
mm,
going into the late 90s for female artists, especially female artists that were not pop or R&B artists, um, that were like singer-songwriter, folk rock artists, and just how difficult they were finding the music landscape. So, um, in in the mid 90s, like 1996, I think that it was like Sarah McLachlan started to like, she wanted to experiment with like, well, what if we did actually like have, I was a headliner and then there was like a woman who was touring with me who was opening for me. And she was like super discouraged against that. The same as like, oh, we can't play women back to back on the
Mhm.
radio. Right. So she started it kind of as an experiment. Like her and Paula Cole went on
Mhm.
tour together. And
Mhm.
then she saw how successful that was. And that's where she got the idea to do Lilith Fair. Um, and so Lilith Fair started in like in its own space in 1997. It was being headlined by like Sarah McLachlan, Paula Cole. I remember people were like demonizing Paula Cole because she performed on Saturday Night
Mhm.
Live and like showed an unshaved armpits on Saturday Night Live. It was either Saturday Night Live or The Tonight Show or something, but like I remember watching that and then I remember people freaking out about
Mhm.
that. But so it was the two of them and then like the Indigo Girls, Jewel, who is like not as prevalent in making new music, but was like kind of at the height of her career, like in the 90s
Mhm.
as well.
Was
Um,
Sophie B. Hawkins part of it too? Because I know she was an out queer woman at the time during her
so
height.
Sophie B. Hawkins might have been a village stage performer, but I don't
Mhm.
know if, or like a second stage performer, but I don't think she was listed as one of the headliners.
Mhm.
So one of the things that I remember about Lilith Fair, which I thought was so cool, was that there would be, and this is similar, I think. I haven't been to Lala at all. I didn't go when it was touring, and I haven't been here. I know you've been,
Mhm.
but like you would go into the like venue. It was like a huge outdoor venue where Lilith Fair would be, and there was like the main stage, which was usually like a big amphitheater, and then there was a second stage where they would have other well-known but not headlining performers. And then there was a village stage. So like the village stage would be people would join for like one or two dates, or like some cities would hold contests where like you could earn a spot on the village stage. So like Christina Aguilera was
Mhm.
on the village stage, like Dido when she was super early in her
Mhm.
career, Nelly Furtado
Mhm.
before she got really big, because Nelly Furtado is a Canadian performer, just like Sarah
Mhm.
McLachlan. So like they knew each other through like Canada music scene. So it was like that that was the village stage, and then there was also like all of these booths and tables where you could go that would be like nonprofits and charities, but also corporations.
Mhm.
So one of the things I remember is that like Planned Parenthood was just everywhere at
Mhm.
Lilith Fair. They were like they were building up like young women's organizing at that time, which like went into like the March for Women that happened like um, in the early 2000s. Uh, so yeah, that's a like general information about Lilith Fair, but it was like wildly successful. And I
Mhm.
think that like people did not
How
expect it
shocking.
to be
Oh,
so
how shocking.
successful. Like they made more money in the first year of Lilith Fair than Lollapalooza did that year. It's like fuck you guys. Like you
It's
don't
like,
want us to tour with you? Fine, we're gonna like get together and do it ourselves. And they grossed more money than Lala during their first year and like made more than like $60 million
mm.
over like the run of the 3 years, which is like wild to me.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and
It's
I love it. I love it. But they raise so much money for nonprofit and
Mhm.
charity organizations too. Like I think it was like $10 million or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, one of my favorite Lilith Fair lore things, which I tell everybody, uh, just like a nerd, is that I'll remind people that like Biore pore strips, the strips that you put on your
Hmm.
nose, and then
Hmm.
like they would have the commercials where you like pull it off your nose. It's supposed to like pull all of the like white heads and black heads off
Hmm.
of your nose. Like they were so big because one of the like they were one of the early corporate sponsors of Lilith Fair. So
Mm.
like when you walked in the gate, everybody like you could walk around to the tables and like pick up gift bags, pick up swag. And
Mm.
like one of the things that I remember getting is like this bag full of like BRA products. And like pore strips were in them. And so like all of these like teenage girls and like Gen X, so Gen X millennial, like teenage girls and women and their friends, we were like all getting Biore pore strips and like trying them out. And then that was like the explosion of the Biore pore strip was like because of Lilith Fair,
Mhm.
because they were like giving out so many at Lilith Fair. I like the same thing with like the Frappuccino and like bottled Frappuccinos from Starbucks. Like that was like the early days of the
Mhm.
Frappuccino, and they were like
Oh yeah.
they would like give out samples at Lilith Fair, and it really caught on. So it was it wasn't like an indie type festival. It was definitely like corporate sponsorship, but also you can tack it onto like the parallel rise of like different things in culture, like related to the rise of Lilith Fair.
Mm. Yeah,
What do
I
you remember, since you didn't go, what do
mhm.
you remember hearing about Lilith Fair at that time? Were you ever interested in going, or were you like, this is not for me?
I didn't think it was for me back then because, growing up as, being or trying to understand my own masculinity, I did not feel like this would be a good fit for me. But I remembered like around 96, 97. I remember Sarah McLachlan's uh surfacing album that came out, and Building a Mystery had a chokehold on me. Adia, I
I'm like
remembered.
building a mystery in the chokehold on everybody.
Yes, it sure did. It still does. And Adia, I remember seeing the video to Adia on VH1 playing all the time, maybe just as much as The Boy Is Mine in the summer of '98. I kid you not. And so I was exposed to Sarah McLachlan music, and around that time, Sheryl Crow had that second album, which had "If It Makes You Happy" when she was going
Hmm.
more into the alternative route. And I was like, wow, this is like I was starting to get into the music that was coming from the Lilith Fair, so to speak. And I didn't get into the weeds like say the Liz Fair or the Ani DeFranco, but I was paying I was starting to pay more attention to some of the women artists. I tried to get into really couldn't I really couldn't get into her. I don't know that was picking up was very popular during that time. I kind of dabbled into them. So like it didn't feel accessible to me, but also like the idea of me going to concerts felt like a far-fetched dream because my parents
Mm.
would never allow me to go to any concerts with with full of strangers, and this is before cell phones. This is a very different time. But I'm curious for you, what was it like going to a Lilith Fair as a teenager in that era where, were your parents like worried about you going out with like your friends or trying to like figure out the logistics and the crowd? I mean, when you think of Lollapalooza or Ozfest, I mean, you think of the very heavy masculine energy that comes into that place. Like moshing was already becoming very dangerous. People were hurt. There was, there was sexual assaults that were happening to women concert goers. There was also safety issues that women experienced at like, you know, going back to the Rolling Stones, of the early '70s, and thinking about like the behaviors that went on, whether it's from the artists or from the organizers or the crowd. I wonder what it was like for you to go to like a big festival that was so transformative?
So it's interesting because like I grew up in a very sheltered household. My parents were extremely overprotective.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but like they loved going to concerts, like
Hmm.
these big concerts. So if I wanted to go to a concert, like one or both of my parents would go with me. And so it's when I went to Lilith Fair, it was like me and my sister and like cousins or a couple friends, and then like my mom. So like all of these concerts that I went to were like with my mom,
Hmm.
because that's the only way I was allowed to go. So like I went to
Hmm.
Lilith Fair with my mom, and she was like super supportive of me like being in a space like Lilith Fair. She actually like she bought me like my first like rainbow sweater and like rainbow themed backpacks, and then was like
Wow.
encourage encouraged this kind of like mainstream pop feminism in me, but then was very upset when I became an actual feminist, and even more upset when I like came out as bisexual when I was
Mhm.
like 19. Um, but like, my first concert that I went to was one that my parents took me to. The Elton John Billy Joel concert. Like my first
Mhm.
concert where I like smelled weed was like a concert that like I went to with my parents. It was the Moody Blues.
Mm.
Also at that same like outdoor amphitheater. So there were some concerts that like I wasn't allowed to go to on my own because it was too dangerous, and like both it was too dangerous and my parents didn't want to go to them. So like Lollapalooza, I was not allowed to go to. And I wasn't allowed to go to concerts on my own until I was like midway through college, kind of. Um, so, uh, yeah, I went to like Horde Tour and like these other festivals, but like my parents would go to, um, which I think it's interesting going to concerts with your like very overprotective mother.
Yeah.
But that I Lilith Fair was for me like seen as a safer space by my mother because it was like all women performers. There wouldn't be mosh pits.
Mhm.
It was like, it was like an indoor amphitheater where it was seated and then lots of lawn space. A very kind of like similar to Ravinia, but like not as bougie, definitely not as bougie as Ravinia, but like that's still that same sort of layout. Um, and so, yeah, that was my experience with like being able to go as a kid was like being heavily chaperoned.
Wow. And what would you describe like the demographics, like
Mm-hmm.
walking into that venue? And did it ever feel like an inclusive environment, or did it feel kind of threatening in some ways?
I think because at that time I didn't have the same understanding of my racial identity
Mhm.
and had no understanding of my sexuality
Mhm.
at that time. Like it felt very there I wasn't necessarily questioning whether it was safe or not, but it
Mhm.
felt familiar because I went to the high school that I went to was like almost all white.
Mhm.
Is probably like 80 to 90% white.
Mhm.
Um, and I would say that like an average Lilith Fair was probably at least like 75% white
Mhm.
people who were
Mhm.
like there in the crowd. Um, but it was also a space where like instead of white people bullying me for being Asian, like I kind of just there are so many people there that I'm just like blending into the crowd.
Mhm.
And it's this idea that like we're all here to like hear women play music, and so like
Mhm.
we're all gonna like accept each other. And I say that like from the perspective of somebody who like got to blend into the crowd in that way. um that like that was my experience of my racial identity at that time, and especially in contrast to like how I experienced it at school, which was like getting relentlessly bullied for being different. um but it was like Gen X folks, a lot of people my age were like there with their moms or like there with like an aunt, there with like another adult. Um, but there was like younger baby boomers, Gen X folks, like older millennials who we were like teenagers. Um, it was where I grew up in the middle of New York was you know, I would say like middle class to like upper middle class crowd because you have to like pay money to like get into these concerts. Um there was a lot of people who just like really were there for the music
Hmm.
and loving the music and not necessarily having the music to be male centered. Like there was definitely, I had this like internalized misogyny at the time of like, I'm serious about the music. It's not just because like, I'm not going to like music just because I think a boy is cute or a guy in the band is cute. Um, and recognizing that later is like internalized misogyny, but I was very much of like, I'm not like other girls type of thing when I was younger. Um, so it was, yeah, it was a lot of people who were like a lot of hippie aesthetic, a lot of just like a lot of lesbian people who are like out lesbians, which like in the late 90s, um, public acceptance of like people who are out lesbians was like starting to grow a little bit. Like Melissa Etheridge
Hmm. Hmm.
was a Lilith Fair performer. The Indigo Girls were Lilith Fair performers. Um, and the idea that like you could be angry and like be really
Hmm.
angry in your music. Fiona Apple was there. She I
Hmm.
think of
Oh,
as like
wow.
one of the like original like angry girl music
Hmm.
people that I ever saw live. Um, and so, yeah, it was formative to me in many ways. And I think that my experience was so specific to like my upbringing as a transnational and transracial adoptee that like grew up in a lot of white spaces because it definitely was a very white space.
Hmm.
I won't say all white because that's a erasure of people, but it was a predominantly white space, both in like the people who were there, the type of like folk rock and rock music that was being offered. Like there wasn't a ton of like genre diversity in terms of like including rap and hip hop in those first couple of years. And also the majority of the performers were white as well.
I wonder about was queer were there queer men or were there men that were at Lilith Fair like as willing audiences or because their girlfriend dragged them to Lilith Fair. I'm curious about
That's
like
a
what
great
yeah. Hmm.
question. Honestly, was not on my mind.
Hmm.
Like I
I
was
mean,
not even paying attention to that. I I was not paying attention to men or looking to see if there was men there or trying to see if there was men in the crowd. I was like very uninterested in the male gaze. Um, which same today. Uh, but like, yeah, I really don't remember. I think it's just because that was the first time that I'd been surrounded by it, like in a crowd with so many women that I didn't know that like wasn't a ballet class.
mm, mm. Interestingly enough, when we talk about the racial dynamics at Lilith Fair, it was known as Lily White Fair. I mean, it was mocked for not having the diversity. Like there was no Asian performers, no Latinx, very little Black women representation. But the breakthrough came when you had Erykah Badu, who was already starting to emerge in her career
Yeah,
as
I
a
think
solo
Erica
artist. Yeah.
Badu joins the second year, I think.
Mhm. And I think, and then Missy Elliott, I believe it was 98, and she was already blowing up, both as a hip hop and R&B artist and producer too.
Hmm.
So she was already emerging. Queen Latifah, a
Yeah,
legendary.
they all joined the final year because I think there was like Tracy Chapman was there the first
Mhm.
year. It's
Mhm.
like folk, so fit the genre.
Mhm.
Like Erica Badu joined the second year. The movement of like neo soul
Mhm.
was like it felt close enough to the like folk rock
Mhm.
indie singer-songwriter coffee house sound. And
Mhm.
then finally that expansion to like rap and hip hop is being
Mhm.
like a totally separate genre from like from the like coffee
Mhm.
house vibe.
And were
Yeah.
there a lot of Lilith Fair purists that were fighting against that? Because it would seem to make sense that there would be a lot of pushback. They're like, oh, well, Lilith Fair is really about folk and soft rock music, but it should not include hip hop or R&B music. I don't know if that was something that was entering in. And another part I do remember was that Lilith Fair, like late night talk show hosts, like the Jay Leno's and Dave Letterman's of the world, they like you would hear like Lilith Fair being mocked constantly, despite the fact that it was a damn successful tour.
I mean, I totally remember that in SNL. Like I used to watch SNL so religiously, and
Hmm.
I remember like the sketches
Hmm.
and the bits that especially like Anna Gasteyer who ended up being a performer at Lilith Fair.
Wow.
But like she had this character that that was like a Lilith Fair performer, and so would like talk about her experiences as a Lilith Fair performer, and like it's both funny, like as somebody who was like went to Lilith Fair, to me it's like
Mhm.
funny in a way of like we're kind of like not taking ourselves too seriously, but then also like on the other hand of like, oh, like I'm making fun of this thing in front of all these other people who also oppose it.
Mhm.
um but yeah, in terms of like the pushback against the racial diversity and against the rise of rap and hip hop being featured at Lilith Fair, I I think that anti-blackness in US culture is unfortunately timeless. Like it is
Mhm.
a thing that does not end. And I think that at that time in the culture, as well as now, like something being rap and hip hop was seen as like moving further and further away from like a purity or moving further and further away from a safeness, which is like the anti-blackness that's rooted in it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, that I think there's been cultural conversation about the ways that like white mainstream culture views artists, non-black artists, as like quote unquote ruining their careers, or even black artists. Like this, I think that this discourse happened a lot with Mariah Carey as well.
Mhm.
But that like
Mhm.
the more you get into like rap and hip hop, and the
Mhm.
further away you get from folk or rock or even pop,
Mhm.
you are like you're ruining your career in a way,
Mhm.
which of course is not true, but is like part of that narrative. So like that happened to Mariah Carey when she
Mhm.
went from like pop to like more hip hop beats.
Mhm.
It happened to Gwen Stefani when she went from No Doubt into her solo career, which I think we can critique her solo career in other ways, but the idea
Mhm.
that like she was moving into more of like a rap and hip hop space, like that was not necessarily
Reggae
the
too.
thing that was like bad
Mhm.
about her
Yeah.
solo career. Um, and so I think because all of the like the mostly like white women who were going were just not as familiar or felt very threatened, to be honest, by performers like Lil Kim,
Mhm.
Foxy Brown,
Mhm.
Eve, who like were reclaiming femininity and womanhood from like a black lens
Mhm.
instead of from this like mainstream like white waves of feminism space.
Mhm.
I think that there is definitely like, oh well, this is I thought this was our space, but it's not, when really like it continues to like be a space for women and women's music and like female artists.
Mhm. Yeah, and I know that one of the I know we didn't get a chance to watch the recent documentary on Lilith Fair, but one of the things that really happened that wasn't talked about was the inclusion of women in other parts of the music industry. You had tech and AV people, you had engineers, you had healthcare professional crew workers, and so it wasn't just about the women performers and the musicians. It was also the people, the organizers, the people that were part of creating that festival and highlighting the work that women were doing, which was very foreign which was very foreign back then and still is to an extent.
And still is. Like there are, I think that it's interesting. Um, I think of someone like Taylor Swift, right? Who like this is not going to be the Taylor Swift discourse podcast. I don't think that like either of us either of us are like well versed enough in
Mm-mm,
like being fans, critical fans of hers to like have
mm-mm,
that conversation. But one of the things that has always been interesting to me about Taylor's career is that like whenever you bring up Taylor Swift, people will be so quick to like tack on someone like Jack Antonoff or like another
mm-hmm,
male producer, as though like she can't write, she is not like writing and like
mm-hmm,
making this music on her own, which she like very much is. I think there's so many things to criticize about a number of the
mm,
artists that
yes.
were performing at Lilith Fair, the same way that there is to like critique about Taylor Swift and the way that she makes music, the way that she like presents herself to the world, the way that she has built her brand. But it's like let her and let all of these other women like have that space on their own and create more. Let's create more space for women who are not like the front facing performers to have more space in the music industry, right? Like you said, as like tech and AV like at a concert site, engineers at a concert site, but also like sound mixers on albums,
Mm-hmm,
like producers and songwriters.
mm-hmm,
That like there should be more spaces for women other than like the performance of femininity and
mm-hmm,
often these days what's demanded of like sexuality that
mm-hmm,
like that people have to perform externally in
mm-hmm.
order to make it big in the music industry.
Yeah, and also like there's also more women songwriters than just Diane Warren.
Yes. Yes, for sure.
Like, yeah, exactly. But I also wonder about like, for Latinx women came in much later too. Like, well, it would start to come in like maybe like towards like the 2000s. But I remember, unfortunately, Selena was gunned down, and this was the potential of seeing a person like her rise, like about to rise, about to really come up, and a person who was really um, getting the attention of young Latinx girls and that wanted to emulate her too. And I think about what it meant for like maybe for Asian American women or Asian diasporic women that were like how they viewed like could they even see themselves in this space, back then, when there were no women artists. I mean, it wasn't until like maybe Karen O from the Yeah Yeah Yeahs like came in like into the 2000s that we started to see this very slow inclusion or the slow introduction of other non-white artists in that space because um rock for a good 40, 50 years has been very dominated by white men and then with white women. So it was very hard for other people who are not white to think that they could have a space, or even for black women artists. Like I think there was this, I don't know if you remember her, her name was Reese, RES. She had like this kind of like this rock album in the early 2000s, and I was like, my gosh, she is really good. And but like for the record companies, like they were like, well, you're not doing R&B music, or Khalees at that time. Khalees was
Mm.
also very much a person you could not put into a genre. Um, and like there were certain artists that that radio was like, I don't know if I want to play her music because I can't because she might be too black for our station, or for black stations, like, oh, her music might be too white for them. So there was a
Right.
lot of
This
dynamics.
expectation that like black artists have to either be doing rap, hip hop, or R&B,
Mhm,
and then like white artists and white artists are allowed to kind of
mhm. Crossover.
insert themselves into any genre
Mhm,
and be celebrated for it. And the same with Latina artists, and
Hmm.
that there's an assumption that like
Hmm.
a Latina artist or like
Hmm.
diasporic Latina artist is going to be doing Spanish speaking
Hmm.
only and is going to be doing like salsa or like some sort of like Latin pop
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
reggaeton. And so, yeah, I think that the way that the way that music, similar to like movies and books, is like obsessed with the categorization of genre.
Hmm. And then when
Yeah.
we got to the end of the 20th century, what do you think was the result of Lilith Fair after those 3 years? Like, what? How do you think this affected Sarah McLachlan's career and how people view her as an artist, but also as the founder of Lilith Fair, and the trajectory of where it was going into the 2000s? Because this was starting to be a different time now, because right around that turn, the teen pop music started to explode. The Backstreet Boys and
Hmm.
Sync, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, and then there was like the Ricky Martin, Enrique Iglesias, Jennifer Lopez. So that was all culminating at that same time, around the time of Lilith Fair's end. And it seemed like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like the artists that we were talking about, like Jewel, Sarah McLachlan, um, Fiona Apple, they started to take a back seat during that time. Or at least it felt like they were kind of like being cast aside to fit in now this new group of artists, this the new pop sensation. So I wonder about your own take on that, or at least from an outsider point of view.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that did happen, which I wouldn't say it's feminism,
Mhm.
right? Like it's not, I wouldn't say that it was like a feminist shift, but Lollapalooza and other festivals like it, like they did start to include more female artists and
Mhm.
more like women fronted groups. Um, but I think that also like continues to ask the question of like just because there's more women there does it mean that it's
Mhm.
feminist, does it mean that it is
Mhm.
like upholding any sort of feminist principle, or that like we are looking at dynamics of power or like
Mhm.
opportunities for collaboration, and like building community, which is like what feminism is so rooted in, or is it just that like more women are there and are being
Mhm.
centered?
Mhm. Mhm.
um, because I think what you were talking about with like the rise of different pop acts, you know, like Britney Spears or
Mhm.
Christina Aguilera, who did get a start at a place like
Mhm.
Lilith Fair, as well as the evolution of just pop as a genre, um, like being separate from the type of music that was being featured at Lilith Fair. Like it strikes me as like so many artists becoming so much more individual, um, that one of the I think there's so many things with the musical landscape, the music landscape and the concert landscape that we could talk about that
Mhm.
shifted like in the years following when Lilith Fair ended. Also, that contributed to the idea that like something like Lollapalooza was also no longer a touring festival. Like it
Mhm.
is a single site festival. And like both of those things, they happened for so many of the same reasons in terms of like burnout, in terms of like having to like get along with a whole bunch of people to like
Mhm.
tour together with them all summer, instead of you just get to like come into one place and like do your thing and then leave. Um, which is like very much what happens at a place like Lollapalooza now.
Mhm.
Whereas like when Lilith Fair was touring, like they were getting to know each other. They were like helping out with each other's children. They were like
Wow.
celebrating birthdays together. They were probably like doing doing that thing that happens when like multiple people who are like menstruating at the same time, like their cycles are syncing and we're like making sure that each other has pads and tampons, right? So um I think that like that era of music
Mhm.
festival just changed a lot in going into like what is more of an individualistic type of
Hmm.
music space today, even if it includes a lot of women, simply because there are so many more artists.
Hmm.
Um, but like these women aren't necessarily always touring together. There are definitely exceptions to that. Like, you know, uh, Beyonce has like
Hmm.
been Beyonce and Beyonce's concerts and Beyonce's music has been a springboard for like showcasing other Black
Hmm.
women artists, especially like Taylor Swift will frequently like take other female artists with her as openers when she's touring. So
Hmm.
like those things are happening, but not in the same to the same scale that Lilith
Hmm.
Fair was happening.
Yeah, it's kind of well, I think when you think of like the turn of that century, especially with the changing music landscape, like you also started seeing like Avril Lavigne, Michelle Branch, and you saw more of like this kind of like the post Lilith Fair take on. It's like, okay, let's have a little bit of fun. Let's be a little bit more rebellious. But it also kind of felt in some ways safe in some ways, because that teen pop era felt like it was more controlled, but it was also like you didn't hear enough of, and like even to the point where like Liz Fair started doing pop music, which like she got grilled by music critics, and then Jewel went into that pop dance mode at one point, and
Yeah,
you know
Liz Fair for
mhm,
like
mhm,
there was, yes, she brought in one of Avril Lavigne's producers.
yes.
Um, and like you could hear the shift in
Mhm,
her work from like one album to another album. One thing that like that just popped into my head as you were speaking is this idea of like, you know, what you were saying so clearly is like teenage
mhm,
pop acts versus like these adult women,
mhm,
and the benefit to the music industry of like having such young artists who maybe don't have as much experience in the industry or like haven't fully learned what they can say no to and build boundaries around,
mhm,
and being at higher risk of like being taken advantage of or being exploited by the industry versus like so many of these adult women who were headliners in Lilith Fair, like already having successful careers, even if they hadn't fully broken into the mainstream yet, but like having being older and having more experience, as like singers,
mhm,
songwriters, and touring musicians, just creates a different dynamic than if it's someone like Britney Spears on her
mhm,
first tour or like Avril Lavigne on her first tour is going to be so much different than like, okay, Bonnie Raitt is here and she's
mhm,
like the concert mother to like all of us here touring with Lilith Fair.
mhm,
And it's something that like continues to then like take away power from the men who are behind the scenes,
mhm.
from like being able to exploit the artists who are on tour.
Yeah, and I also think about like the effect of Lilith Fair that it had on a lot of grown women, or like seasoned artists, I would say. Like Madonna at that time had a career revival with Ray of Light. And I think in some ways it was kind of inspired by Lilith Fair in some ways too, when she was starting to really embrace more of the introspective take of motherhood, and that became like one of her biggest albums. And also it created like the longevity, which was very rare among women. Like if you were past 35 years old, you were considered a has-been or a wash. But then you look at Tina Turner, I mean, she was like probably like one of the few outliers that defied the ageism, and became like one of the biggest touring artists at the end of the 90s, also around the time of Lilith Fair. So it it seemed to be on par. And I also think about like Cher. Like people had thought that Cher was her career was basically in the gutter for a number of years, which I think it's very wrong. But in the pop landscape, no one thought that she was going to have a number one hit in 1998 at the age of 50 years old. So I think that around that time, you also started seeing like even some of the older women all of a sudden become or start having these career revivals that are in the pop mainstream landscape, which you really would never think would happen. And I think that still is a problem today, to be honest with you, because it's hard to see 40 plus year old women um chart on the Billboard these days. It just feels like it's still a very ageist landscape. Um
Totally, like the
yeah.
ageism and the sexism kind of woven together. You know, I think of a band like the Rolling Stones,
Hmm.
and they're so old and they keep touring, and people are just like, yes, they're so good, they have to keep touring, but they like won't go to see a woman who's like over 45 touring. You know,
Oh, I
like
know.
there's exceptions, right?
Hmm.
But like, you know, someone like Sarah McLachlan, who I've seen so many times,
Hmm.
but haven't been able to go see the times that she's been in or near Chicago. Um, you know, like in her concerts aren't necessarily selling out anymore, and it makes me sad, right? That like as a
Hmm.
touring musician, like um, she's not necessarily like at the height of her fandom anymore.
Hmm. Hmm.
But then also, like, I think about the Indigo Girls who I have been able to see, usually because their concerts are a little bit more affordable for me
Hmm.
now.
Hmm.
But like, they are also older and touring.
Hmm.
Um, but they are, yeah, they're touring smaller venues. They're not looking to sell out stadiums or arenas anymore the same way, or amphitheaters, although they are selling out some. But they're
Hmm.
not looking to like sell out those sorts of venues in every single city,
Hmm.
and have such a loyal fan base from just being such regular tours all the time. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
but yeah, I think of the ways that, like, you know, someone like Missy Elliott, like when she went on tour after being a part of Lilith Fair, like she she really learned from that experience and like credits it with when she like invited Alicia Keys
Hmm.
and Beyonce to like go out on tour with her, that she was like, oh yeah, like I can have women open for
Hmm.
me, and I can use my concert platform to like lift up artists. At that time, like Beyonce was like just in the process of like leaving Destiny's Child to like be a solo artist.
Hmm.
So I think of that as like being a cool thing that she like credits Lilith Fair for. um it's like, and also like just so wild to think of like Beyonce being a solo opening artist when she's like one
Hmm.
of the like biggest artists of our time now.
Yeah, you know what was also kind of interesting because I was having this conversation with Angela on Lady Gaga, and Lady Gaga opened up when she began her career. She opened up for New Kids on the Block, which to me, I'm it lives rent free in my head. I'm just like, how is that even possible? You know, it's
Hmm.
like you have a very emerging, eccentric star with quite a wardrobe coming in, and New Kids on the Block were like years past their prime. They were in
Yeah.
reunion legacy status, so it didn't make any sense. And she was also opening up for the Pussycat Dolls too, which
Yeah, and like the genre difference. That reminds
yeah.
me of how like Lizzo got
Mhm.
her touring
Mhm.
start, like opening, I think it was for Sleater Kinney, which I think of them
Wow.
as like being very
Wow.
different genres as well. But also like an example of like showcasing like female musicians.
Yeah, yeah. And when you think about like Lilith Fair now, if it like well in 2010 they tried to revive it, and
Hmm.
unfortunately it didn't work out. I mean, tickets were not selling, bigger acts were canceling it. It just felt like it was very much in disarray. And then I think one of the failures of that fair was that it didn't seem to grow with the times. It didn't evolve into the
And that's
changing landscape.
something that
Yeah.
like Sarah McLachlan has admitted.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a very different landscape by that point because Lady Gaga, the return of the pop spectacle was starting to emerge. Kesha was very big, Britney Spears, I mean, unfortunately that was during conservatorship era, but like the Rihanna's, like you had like the pop spectacle was really coming back in full force. And Taylor Swift was already starting to come into her own, so it didn't feel like they needed a Lilith Fair to use it as a stepping stone. But I also felt like in some ways that a lot of like independent women artists were kind of ignored or at least put cast aside, especially with the
That's
changing
something,
landscape. Yeah.
yeah, that's something that I think about as well. That I think the the space of a festival, especially a festival like Lilith Fair, right? Like with the village stages, which would usually be
Mhm.
like a platform under like a small tent with like someone being up there with like a guitar and a microphone and like
Mhm.
maybe some band members behind them. Like you could win a contest to like
Mhm.
get that spot. Um, it feels so much different now than the way that most folks will tour. Like
Mhm.
I think festivals are sometimes a good place to like showcase smaller artists. I won't necessarily say independent artists all the time, although like that can definitely happen. Like,
Mhm.
a place like Coachella or a place
Mhm.
like
True.
Lollapalooza, like you could, or definitely, like a place like Pitchfork, which Pitchfork is not in existence anymore. But
Mhm.
that's a place where you could like hear something really new you might not hear on the radio, or that might not, back then be played on like MTV or VH1, like might not have those like
Mhm.
music videos that were in regular rotation. But I do think of that piece being lost, of like the way that the festival landscape has shifted. So like when you want to go to lots of different places, you'll people would usually tour by yourself
Mhm.
now.
Mhm.
Whereas like if you want to perform with a lot of other people, or you're just gonna like go and like perform with a lot of people but then leave, like that's when you would play at a festival. The festival isn't necessarily going to multiple places,
Mhm.
um, because of the logistics of that.
Mhm.
So that's a thing that I am thinking about in terms of like how do independent artists get
Mhm.
to break through into the mainstream?
Mhm.
Um, like is TikTok the new village stage?
Mhm. The
Is
algorithms,
YouTube
yeah. I mean,
is
how does the
YouTube the new village stage? And I have a
Mhm.
few artists that like I've discovered
Mhm.
through Instagram,
Mhm.
in that like reshares TikToks. I'm not on TikTok because I'm an elder
Mhm.
millennial, but there's a
I
few
was on
folks that like
TikTok.
I've
I
discovered
was. Mhm.
I've discovered independent artists through Instagram via TikTok. Um, but I think that there are fewer live spaces to
Mhm.
see and discover artists in that way, unless you live in a place like Chicago where there's constantly live music. I didn't grow up in a place like
Mhm.
Chicago, or like in a place where it was like a suburb close enough to a place like Chicago. So that wasn't the music landscape that I had access to. Um, so I would only get to see these like mainstream or indie artists through the independent alternative radio station, or through like a big festival that had like a third stage where I could see like local folks.
Yeah. I also wondered if Lilith Fair were to be brought out, how would it respond to the current political social
Mm,
climate? Because when it ended, like during its time, it was during the Clinton era. So it missed out the entire Bush era.
for sure.
And
Yeah.
also like when it was trying to be revived, that was during Obama's first term. But with Trump the past 10 years, uh, I wonder what that would have looked like and how would they have responded to like the Black Lives Matter movement, to immigration, to stop anti-Asian hate. How would a person like Sarah McLachlan respond to like these growing social concerns, and also having to recognize that yes, you are a white woman that's very privileged. How like how how can a place like how can um an institutional mainstay like Lilith Fair survive in that context or be trusted to be that venue? Like who would you have to invite? Who would you have to disinvite if, one of the artists said something that was anti-black
Hmm.
or very Trump adjacent, and how social media moves. So I wonder what that would have looked like. And also not to mention even though Lilith Fair included a number of queer women, Well, what about trans women? What about non-binary folks? What would have that look like too, you know?
Yeah, I think those are all really interesting questions to like bring Lilith Fair into like what's the present day context, and I think even the context that they left behind, that can be critiqued, like when Lilith Fair was around, right? Because it was started by white women who were talking to other women who were in their sphere. And so that ended up including Black women who were making the same type of music, but because there wasn't a lot of genre diversity, like it was not going to include the breadth of like racialized women making lots of different types of music. Um, One of the things that I think about, especially in terms of like what a space like Lilith Fair might look like today or how it might operate, is and I think that, I didn't go to the relaunch of Lilith Fair back in 2010. I was like, number one, pretty broke. I was like in grad school making
Mm.
my salary at that time was $800 a month. So I was definitely not going. I was not going to Lilith Fair. I was not going to Lollapalooza. Like that year was a very broke year for me. It was like a very low earning year for me. But one of the things I think about that happened then and happens now was like all of the internalized misogyny and heterosexism that is acceptable within society, and like the centering of men that was then and it still is now so acceptable within mainstream feminism. This idea of like we have to bring in men into our feminist space. So, for instance, like in abortion rights, you'll see lots of like men for choice groups popping up, that like center and celebrate men for like becoming these megaphones of
Mhm.
feminist rhetoric while also like ignoring women for having those same ideas. So not that I am not anti Pearl Jam or not anti Eddie Vedder, but I will also
Mhm. Mhm.
often see folks
Mhm.
celebrating Eddie Vedder for like being supportive of abortion and Planned Parenthood in ways that like I don't necessarily see them
Mm.
supporting or celebrating women artists for doing the same thing, right? Like Pearl Jam is like relentless tours. That's like a
Yeah.
thing that they're known for as a band. And so like it's something that I've seen people just like love on Eddie Vedder and Pearl Jam for. Um, while also it being so acceptable in society to like make fun of a space like Lilith Fair. So that's something that I think about a lot. I also think that if Lilith Fair were to try and happen in the same way, and I'm sure that like it this was part of why it wasn't as successful in 2010, um, is that it would be because of the amount of money it takes to like run that sort of festival. You have to be just so aligned with corporate interests and corporate
Mhm.
sponsorship, and so and to like you're playing to like kind of the
Mhm.
widest mainstream audience, right? And so to me, it would be like if the Women's March were a music festival, like
Mhm. Mhm.
if
Mhm.
Lilith Fair were a festival that toured, it would be so dependent on each location
Mhm.
rather than like having some sort of like principle that an investment in like intersectionality and supporting people who are multiply marginalized, um, like as part of like an overarching approach to its principles, right? So in some places, like the women, like in Chicago, the Women's March like features a racial diversity of women. It includes trans women in leadership, and it has an analysis around disability. But in other places that are not Chicago, like it does not have those things. It is like wholly like a very very white space, a very very middle class space,
Mhm.
a very mainstream space. And I think about Lilith Fair's um, kind of attention to and focus on a specific kind of women artist. Like not only were like Black women and other women of color not necessarily included as musicians unless they fit a certain type of genre, but even women who were, there was a lot of women um, who were part of like the alt girl, riot girl
Hmm.
space, who were not part of Lilith Fair as well. It's like an artist like Ani DeFranco
Hmm.
was not part of Lilith Fair. Luscious Jackson, the group Luscious Jackson, like they thought that something like Lilith Fair was like super corny.
How
You
about
know,
Annie Lennox? What about Annie Lennox? Was she considered for that too?
I don't know. I would have to look. I would have to
No,
look that up to
no.
see if Annie Lennox was like part of Lilith Fair. But like, I think about all of these reasons why like there
Hmm.
were artists who just weren't part of Lilith Fair, whether the music was considered too alternative or whether like they were having a battle with like their own internalized misogyny
Hmm.
about what it would mean to like be in an all women's music space or whether the genres were just like not seen as like fitting into the mold. So I
Yeah.
think that all of those things would
Mm.
have to be taken into consideration. Um, and I think that there's also a space, like a conversation that we could have about, and that people I feel like keep having and an insistence on, like politics being separate from the rest of our lives and politics being separate from
Hmm.
culture.
Hmm.
So my experience of Lilith Fair is that it was a space for women and feminism. Like Planned Parenthood was there, um, but we're very much seen as like politics is separate from music
Hmm.
now.
And very
Um,
mainstream nonprofit too,
right. So like
Yeah.
even though like fans and non-fans, demand that performers like Beyonce
Hmm.
or Taylor Swift like speak out about certain issues, like
Hmm.
they are very mute on those issues, right? Like
Hmm.
Taylor Swift isn't necessarily like issuing statements to like in support of Palestine.
I was gonna
Beyonce is
say that.
not
Hmm.
necessarily saying like ICE out of our country,
Hmm.
right? And so
Hmm.
there's this idea now that like politics and culture are very different and that like everybody belongs in a fandom. Um, and so I think something like Lilith Fair would have to contend with like that pressure within culture that like politics
Yeah.
don't belong here. Um, Whereas I think that with or without Lilith Fair, like, are we understanding feminism,
Hmm.
right? As like a foundation and a system to remake and rethink the way that we're interacting with each other. We're thinking about feminism as like an analysis of power, like who has power over who else, which is what I understand feminism to be. Or are we thinking about feminism as just a way to like have lots of women somewhere, or a way to like have women become equal with men? And then what often is unsaid is like have white women become equal with white men. So I
Hmm.
think there are larger questions about like what is the role of feminism as like
Hmm.
an
Hmm.
animating force like in
Hmm.
music, and what is how do we see ourselves relating to each other through gender when it
Hmm.
comes to the intersections of feminism and culture.
Yeah, I really appreciate you taking us through the weeds of it because I wonder, like, could Lilith Fair, um, would Lilith Fair be equipped to handle like the kind of sponsors that they invite in? Are they connected to funding Israel, or or some of the artists, are they Zionists? Like, so there's a lot of contentions like these days of like, well, okay, well, how is this festival being made? Who's it sponsored by? Who's supporting it? And what money is it funneling towards? So I think that these things we are now examining a lot more closely than we did say 20, 30 years ago, especially in this day and age. And yeah,
Totally.
yeah.
And I
And,
think any corporation that's going to be large enough to sponsor a music festival
mhm,
is like, you don't get to be that big unless you're doing something shitty, right? Like,
of
even
course.
like you and I are like huge fans of Rihanna, right?
Of
Like,
course.
we went to
Of course.
see
hmm
Rihanna's
10 years
last
ago.
tour that we like,
10
I
years
don't know if
ago.
we knew it was going to like kind of be I don't want to say it's her final tour, but I don't think we knew it was going to be this long until she like
Mhm,
made music again. But like, even somebody like Rihanna, like, she didn't
mhm,
become a billionaire
mhm,
by like paying everybody who is like making all of her underwear and lingerie and like
skincare.
skincare products like to the fullest extent of like how they should be paid,
hmm
right? So
hmm
even the artists and the
hmm
people that we may love
hmm
their art, like, they are does not necessarily mean that like they are making their money in socially just ways. And so
hmm
any artist that is going to be seeking or needing corporate sponsorship in order to like share their art with the world at the scale that they might want to, it's like going to be making compromises. And it's
hmm
like, where it's a question, just a question of like, where do we as fans sit with how artists are making those compromises? Like, what are our expectations of musical artists and celebrities to like be be activists and advocates, even if they
hmm
aren't? Like, what are we projecting onto them to make ourselves feel better about our fandom in
hmm
order to be like, I can support this artist and their politics?
Yeah, it's still an ongoing process for me because God knows how many people I've had to like silence on my playlist. And it's like, okay,
I
you know
know
what?
you've been going through like your whole evolution of like, what does it mean to be a fan, like
Yeah.
in this age of like genocide and exploitation. It's been really
And
interesting, like, as
yeah.
your friend, to like watch you go through that and to like talk about it with you.
Yeah, no, it's certainly something I've been unpacking, especially in my 40 plus years of being here. It's like, okay, like right now, like why like why should I be spending $200 on a hoodie where maybe an independent artist who is really genuinely doing good music and putting themselves out there, or a grassroots organization, or doing mutual aid, especially in this critical time. I'm like right now the world is on fire in all cylinders, and I think right now the pop spectacle of it starting to fade out because we're dealing with very grim realities at the moment. Economically speaking, it's a very dire situation. Um, Independent artists are struggling to make money, especially in the age of AI and Spotify, and and paying just pennies, uh, at the very least, at the very most, for their music, which also ruins the creativity and the autonomy that they have as artists to explore, not have much of the platform. So it's it's a very difficult landscape to watch happen, and seeing how it affects art, and also how we consume it, and how we have to be very vigilant about what we are supporting and the consequences of where our dollars are going to. And so we I know that people will say like, oh, it's cancel culture, like we're too quick to judge, or we can't expect perfectionism. But we should be able to ask questions. We should be able to, you know, um, to expect better, or to at least be like, hey, you know what? I'm just gonna divest. I think that there's better ways I could spend my afternoon. I don't think I need to go to a concert. Like this year, I had like zero concerts. I don't know if there's any shows that I'm really interested in unless Sade comes out of retirement, which I'm still waiting 16 years later. Um, Sade, if you are ever listening, somehow if the algorithms reaches you, I hope that you somehow do a farewell tour because
My gosh, the concept of
uh,
Sade listening to your podcast is so delightful
it would be oh,
to
that would be
me.
fantastic. I mean, I love Sade. I feel like when Wanda Sykes, when she was basically begging on Sade's knees to not go away, to not.
Hmm.
She's like, I know you're gonna disappear in 10 years, and I'm like, damn, but now it's like already 16 years. I'm like, I'm looking at the clock. But yeah, like, but I also wonder that there are some women artists, like, a Bjork, a Shirley Manson, that would balk at it. They're like, absolutely not. And also because their positions are considered more extreme, on their political views and also their artistic side and what they value, especially when there's more artists that are looking at things from a decapitalized mentality too. So it's like a
Well,
big festival may not necessarily benefit them either.
I think about like there's specific festivals that I feel like live in the legacy of Lilith Fair, both in
Mhm.
like Lilith Fair's accomplishments, but also like Lilith Fair's mistakes, right?
Mhm.
Or not live in the legacy, but like you can look at them in conversation with like what has come after Lilith Fair. So like Brandy Carlisle's
Mhm.
festival. Like she has for the past few years has had a festival, the Girls Just Want a Weekend, which is like in in
Mhm.
Mexico. Um, so it's like a lot of women, very white. It's like a heavily country and folk space that's like kind of going into this space in Mexico that like none of them are like part of.
Mhm.
But it is a space where like women, it's like a heavily like all women space, and like very lesbian space, and like all of the performers are women. But I'm also, and like that has a very kind of like political focus, right? Because Brandy Carlisle is like very outspoken
Mhm.
in
Yes.
very specific ways around like women's rights and feminism, like LGBTQ rights and all of that. But then I also think of a space like Afropunk, right?
Mhm.
Which is has a lot more gender diversity, but also is like uplifting Black women in a way that like a space like the Girls Just Want a Weekend might not be centering Black is not centering Black women in the same way.
Mhm.
Like there may be Black women who are there performing, but it's not centering Black women both either as performers or as fans. And so it's like I think and Afropunk is like a heavily politicized space from like a racial justice perspective, like a gender perspective as well, like a Black feminist perspective. And so I think about like those two types of spaces as like other like just political orientations towards like what a festival can look like today. And then of course there's like
Mhm.
the festival that just happened and is happening again next weekend, Coachella,
Yes.
which is like sapping all of the water from the Coachella Valley and like making it harder for like the people who are there, like serving like the workers of Coachella to like it's
Mhm.
making where they live a worse place to live and like
Mhm.
feeding and lining the pockets of like somebody who is supporting right wing goals,
Mhm.
which like goes back
Mhm.
to I think what you were saying a lot about fandom, like what does it mean to be a fan, what are the
Mhm.
expectations that we are putting on these like large moments of pop culture to like mobilize for our movement building, in the absence of like our our desire to like do other types of organizing or be able to tap into other types of organizing.
Yeah. And with that also said, I think about who could be a potential lineup for a Lilith Fair if it were to be revived. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
who would be an ideal fit? I mean, I think of Student Archives, who I really, really love. Olivia Rodrigo, Sabrina Carpenter, Cardi B, Miley Cyrus, Mitski, Japanese Breakfast, Janelle Monáe, her, SZA.
I mean, Janelle Monáe was, I think, was going to be a
Oh
performer
yeah,
at
right.
the revived Lilith Fair. Nora
Yeah,
Jones as well. Nora
Norah
Jones, I
Jones.
think, was one of the folks that had pulled
Yes,
out. Um,
yes. Yes. And like her, SZA.
mhm.
I could see Lady Gaga like doing like one of those special appearances because she's a showgirl, so I could totally see like the versatility, especially in parts of her career. I could kind of see that. Rhiannon Giddens, Coco Jones, Tiana Taylor, Carol G, a big Latinx
I'm
artist.
like, this is like so multi-genre.
I am trying to because I'm like, look, let's talk about the current times. Like, what would make sense? You mean like Chaperone, obviously I could see that. Value June. I think you brought Value June up. Megan Thee Stallion, Boy Genius, or three of the solo or three of the members solo.
Hmm.
Any of them could work, like Phoebe Bridgers, Lucy. They could easily, perform in a place like that. Maggie Rogers, who I really do love. I saw her a couple years ago and really enjoyed her music. Kesha, especially where she is at now in her career, now as an independent artist, which makes me very happy because I have followed her career. I have followed her journey, and I've always had a very soft spot for her. So it's like to see her be able to get her own music back is very powerful. And um, that's powerful. Muna, Carly Rae Jepsen. People have to stop saying that she's more than that Call Me Maybe song. I swear.
I love Carly Rae Jepsen,
I love her.
Queen of the
Oh,
Sad Banger, her and Robin.
absolutely. Absolutely. Robin could be a good one too.
Also,
Brandy Carlisle.
let's say hello to my cat.
Hey.
Well, Robin is going to be playing at some of Harry Styles' dates this summer.
Oh wow. Oh
Hmm.
wow, what a
He
treat.
typically will have female artists open for him.
Good,
Like
good, good.
it'll either be female artists and or like queer male
Mhm.
artists will be his
Wow,
openers.
that's dope. Brandy Carlisle, yeah, we talked about Casey Musgraves. I think Lizzo right now, she's kind of having her own fallout of her career. It's kind of interesting to really watch how far she's come crashing down, mainstream wise, especially after the
It's
allegations. Yeah.
it's been interesting like
Mhm,
um watching kind of the
mhm,
ways that
mhm,
mainstream
mhm.
culture has like dismissed and kind of thrown away somebody
Yeah.
like Lizzo
Hmm.
in the same way, like the ways that people have also just been like so quick to
Hmm. Hmm.
quote unquote like try and cancel someone like Chapel Roan.
Yeah. Hmm.
I feel like it speaks to even though there are so many women who are touring, like there are so many female artists who have been part of Lollapalooza, like Chappell Roan included, right? But like
Hmm.
Billie Eilish
Billie Eilish. Oh yeah.
is like a headliner. Rosalia is a headliner. Like all of these, there was a K-pop group that was a headliner. Like even
Hmm.
though women are being included in these spaces, and definitely not as much as they could, but like being included more, it to me it definitely doesn't feel like we are making space for like a feminist understanding
Hmm.
of like supporting women artists, and like we said, like especially independent
Hmm.
artists,
Do you,
but
do you-
it's harder and harder to like have spaces for like touring independent
yeah.
artists, especially if they're women, especially if they're people of color, and especially if they're women of color.
And also the fan base too. I mean, like, I wonder if K-pop, how if it would fit in that kind of an atmosphere, in that kind of landscape too. Like, would a K-pop girl group, you know, um, find a place in a place like that, or the fact that maybe it's too big that, I mean, they do perform. I mean, you see them perform like at Coachella, Lollapalooza, which is becoming more commonplace. I mean, K-pop fans have a very, very dedicated base, and especially with now
Mm-hmm.
K-pop Demon Hunters that has really grown. It's like we're seeing like another version of teen pop, emerge in a different direction, and
For
it's
sure.
it's quite an evolution to witness that. And I kind of wonder, like, yeah, the days of Lilith Fair may feel very antiquated to what it is now, but I feel like in this age of festivals and maybe the future of festivals, what is that going to look like maybe 10 years from now when things start to rapidly change with, the way artists are being promoted and how they're getting paid, what's their budget. Yeah, it's a very interesting time, but I think maybe a question to wrap up is like, what would be like some of the memorable songs I know this is like a rabbit hole question here, but what would be some of the memorable songs that stand out to you during the Lilith Fair era that you're like, wow, I can I feel so deeply connected to it, like as part of my life soundtrack.
So, um, Possession by Sarah McLachlan.
Hmm.
Um, Fumbling Towards Ecstasy is like one of my favorite
Hmm.
all-time albums. So Possession um, is definitely such a standout from Lilith Fair. Um, Criminal by Fiona Apple. And like
Hmm.
I grew up playing the piano, and so I
Wow.
loved musical artists that played the piano. So like
Hmm.
Fiona Apple and like Tori Amos
Hmm.
and like
Hmm.
Ben Folds, like Elton John, Billy Joel, right?
Hmm.
So um I loved watching Fiona Apple like perform Criminal.
Hmm.
Um Fast Car by Tracy Chapman is also like one of my
Hmm.
all-time favorite
Hmm.
songs. And so like getting to see her perform that live was incredible for me. And then one of the one of the common Lilith Fair occurrences that would happen at every show, um, and happens now like when the Indigo Girls tour solo, is that like Closer to Fine is always the closing
Hmm.
song of their encore. But like at Lilith Fair, they would invite the other headliners to join them on stage and like
Hmm.
all sing Closer to Fine together.
Wow.
So you would have like six or seven women on stage with Amy and Emily of the Indigo Girls, like all singing Closer to Fine. And the Indigo Girls would be like usually the closing performer. So it was like the end of their encore
Hmm.
as the second headliner that they were performing. So Closer to Fine, like I've seen it live so many
Hmm.
times and I love
Hmm.
it every single time, whether it's
Hmm.
Amy and Emily singing it by themselves or whether it's like a group of seven women who are like singing it all together.
Yeah. And I think that there's some songs that really come out of that era. Like I Will Remember You by Sarah McLachlan, the live version. It gives me so much goosebumps. And and I remember that was our high school graduation song when the high school choir sang that. And so I still get kind of like in my own emotions to that song. I will say Carnival or Wonder by Nellie Merchant or These Are the Days when she was with 10,000 Maniacs. Yeah, timeless. Sheryl Crow's second album, like If It Makes You Happy, Every Day is a Winding Road, to her third album, which had songs like My Favorite Mistake, There Goes the Neighborhood. Um, who else would it be? I think of who else could it also be? Missy Elliott, that first album when she did Can't Stand the Rain. That was such an epic music video that was way ahead of its time. I remember that very well. I mean, she was in this big bloated uh you know, she was in this big bloated um I want to say hefty bag, but but I think apparently like when she was going to Virginia Beach, like they had to fill it up at a gas station, I think, I kid you not, because
It was like a big air suit.
it's a big air suit basically, and it was so epic, and I loved it. I love her creativity. Um, Nelly Furtado's Whoa Nelly album. People sleep on that album. Okay, so everyone thinks of the Timbaland connection and Timberlake. No, everyone needs to like really re-listen to the Whoa Nelly album. Like Shit on the Radio, I'm Like a Bird. That was some. That was such a good album. I don't know if you're a fan of it, but I was a huge fan of that album.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I this has been such a great deep dive. I really
I
enjoyed
know
this
this is
discussion.
like we've been talking for like 2.5 hours. So
I
if
know.
if anyone has made it to the end of our conversation, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope that you get to like support your local indie artists and make sure that that you are supporting their work and also like yeah, I think this is a really good deep dive and I hope that people will think about the nostalgia in their lives that they've grown up with and I hope this kind of sparks good memories or maybe some curiosity for you to discover this. But I really, really enjoyed this so much. So, Jung, thank you so much. Love to
Go
always have you on.
find, I, I just want everyone to like go find a like Lilith Fair playlist on whatever music streaming you're using. I know that I have like definitely found them on Tidal, so hopefully you will be able to as well.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a good one.